Hi, everyone. I just wanted to talk a bit about three or four different chapters in our book. I really want to go into chapter 4 and then leaf back to chapter 17, and then finally go into chapters 7, 8, and 9. I like to refer you to this book because I think it's one of the better ones that you can use. It does have some useful, helpful information, and I really do think that this textbook would be useful to keep as you go down the road into other classes, which have you use writing, but also too professionally. If you happen to have your textbook, or not your textbook, your handbook from college writing, which is the Brief Penguin Handbook, you should definitely keep that because it's a very good, useful handbook. If you don't have a handbook, then of course you can go to owl.english.purdue.edu. And then the other option, as I mentioned to you before, is at mytechcomlab.com. You have the electronic copy of our textbook, but there's also a handbook on there, so those are available too. Now, what I wanted to tell you is something that I feel that is useful. If you ever work with a group of people in writing a document, one of the main things that you want to do is make sure that you have the same style and the same format. And a lot of companies these days will have a style guide or a style manual. I was in the Navy for 4 years, and we used the U.S. Navy Correspondence and Style Guide. So they told you how to set documents up, what types of headings to use, and so on. If you ever go on Google, type NASA, NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Association, and they have a style guide there. And so they say how they want headings, what words they want capitalized, how they want their paragraphs split up, and those types of things. I mean, they're very, very useful. Both my sister and my brother both worked at one point for the CIA, and of course, they have a style guide. The FBI does. All government agencies do. However, if you're working on a project with several people and you don't have a style guide, I have two suggestions for you. In the very back of our book, there's a planning form right inside the back cover, and it talks about the purpose, the audience, your primary audience, your document, how you're going to set it up. But also, too, if you look in chapter 4, starting on page 102, they talk about elements of page design, which is the first one are grids. And if you look on page 104, are you going to use a 2-column spread, a 3-column spread? Where there's different options as far as that goes. How are you going to use graphics or visuals? How are you going to caption them underneath them, above them, to the side? Are you going to use text boxes? How are you going to use white space, which they mentioned on page 105? How are you going to use margins, which is absolutely very important. They also mention on page 106 is paragraph length. How long will your paragraphs typically be? When will you split up your paragraphs? Do you split them up in a natural pause? Are you going to format them in a different way? How are you going to do that? Even paragraph indenting is important. And then they have on page 107 as far as running headers and footers. In Microsoft Word, of course, you can put a header in the top of the document or a footer at the bottom. So if you're going to use those, how are you going to use them? Headings, which they mentioned on page 107. What types of subheadings you're going to use. 108, they talk about parallel format. And parallel format would be if you're using an ing verb for one, you would use ing for the others. If you're asking a question, how should we do this? For one heading, you would use a question for other headings. So look at page 109. They have a first level, second level, third level, fourth level, but it gives you suggestions as far as how to break them down. Also in Microsoft Word, there's a increase indent and decrease indent. They have like an arrow in Word where if you're writing a document, and for example, even if you're using an outline format and you want to break something down into 1A, And then if you have, the next point would be B, but if you wanted to break point B down into a subpoint, you would hit the increase indent, and Word would set up the pattern automatically for you. List, which I mentioned on page 111 and 112, the in-text emphasis on 112. Are you going to use bold or underline? Are you going to use colored fonts? Are you going to use capital letters and so on? Type size on page 113, and I have a suggestion with that. With type size, you don't want to ever go too small or too large for that matter, but you have to really think about the document that you're writing. With instructions, typically you want to make sure your instructions are clear and readable. So especially as a person is looking at them on a counter or working in a garage or so on, that they can see them at a glance. So that's a factor. In your document, though, any document, you really don't want to try to use more than 3 different types of fonts. You should try to keep it, if you can, to one font, which is very, very important. And even on page 114, they talk about the use of color, color in your font size and color overall. So they do mention that. And just for your information, there's a chapter a little later in this book, chapter 12, about using graphics and so on. And then on page 402, reasons for using special fonts, color, and graphics. And so they talk about using colors effectively, and they go through that on 402, 3, 4, 5, and they go on a little bit more there. What's interesting is they talk on page 407, consider the tone you want to convey through the font you're using. And if you're doing a wedding invitation, you can use a cursive fancy font. If you're doing a party event, you can make a fun font. So there's different options, but formatting is so important. But the main thing that I wanted to talk about is on page 409. We talked about a style sheet as far as the document, but on 409 they talk about developing a color style sheet. And they go through and give you suggestions there on to page 413. And then on 14, they have general guidelines for use of graphics. So take a look at that, because the information there is very useful. So I wanted to talk, like I said, about the style guidelines for writing a document, but you also need to consider what colors you're using, what the colors you're using are conveying, and so on. So all of that is important. You want to have consistency. I think I told you this before. I went to Chatham University, and in 2010 I finished a degree in professional writing. And for 3 or 4 different projects I had, we had to do collaborative documents. So for example, one semester we had to do a collaborative web page. And so at that particular time, there was that disaster in Haiti. And so the 3 of us worked on disaster relief. And so our web page, I think it was 5 or 6 pages total, but our visuals and everything and our headings and so on had to be consistent. I also did an assignment with another student, and she and I were looking at MP3 players. So we looked at the iPod, we looked at the Sony has one, I can't recall it, and Microsoft has one called the Zune. And so we looked at those and we compared them. But there again, we had to make sure that we were consistent, and we were very conscious of that. When you do documents together, one of the good options you have is you can actually create a collaborative type of document at a wiki. You can do that, or you can also go through Google has a blog place. It's Google Blogs, or there's a place called the Blogspot. And so you can work collaboratively on a document rather than sending it back and forth and emailing. And so it's a better, more efficient way to write a particular document. I also, too, just for your information, I wanted to refer you to Chapter 17 in our book. And if you happen to have that, Chapter 17 talks about style in writing and the overview of style. And this chapter really focuses on clarity in writing, writing clear sentences, pretty much on 590 and 591, sentence guidelines, being concise. That's the trick for technical writing. You want to be descriptively concise. And that seems like an oxymoron, but it actually is not, because sometimes you have space limitations, sometimes you have time constraints. If you're writing on how to use a defibrillator, a person isn't going to really look at that really closely. I mean, they just have to get the basic idea and use the defibrillator. So they give nice suggestions, but even on page 596, as far as being accurate in wording, not only is that important in technical writing, but I also teach a police report writing class. And if you say in a report the person had a weapon can be any number of things. A weapon can be a ballpoint pen. It can be a pair of scissors. It can be a knife. It can be a hunting knife. It can be a pistol, a baseball bat. So you really have to elaborate as far as what was said. I mean, what the item was, and you also have to be accurate, because if you're not accurate, you are going to have some problems or some issues. So anyhow, that chapter 17 covers that. In the very back of the book, there's also some appendixes to explain more information that will be of use to you. So I like to mention that. Chapter 17, or not chapter 17, chapter 7, excuse me, talks about process, explanations, and instructions. For this particular class, you are going to be doing, obviously, many of you have already, you'll be doing the written instructions, and on page 201 to page, I'll go on for a few pages, from page 201 to 207, they give you some helpful guidelines as far as writing good, clear instructions. And so take a look at that, because you'll find that information helpful. And not only, practice your instruction writing skills for this class, but obviously practice them at work. If you're a chef, if you're a business owner, or whatever it is that you do, you want to have work done consistently and evenly. So that's very essential. And I really can't stress that enough to you. So they use, pretty good examples. Page 219, they use an example of a document in written format, in paragraph format. And look at the difference on page 220 when they put it more instruction format, where they use commands to begin steps, they use notes, they use numbers. It makes a big difference. I really can't tell you that. So that's really essential. The last part that I wanted to refer to a little bit is chapter 8 and 9. In chapter 8, they talk about informal reports. Informal reports can even be a letter report, a memo report, even an email report. They can be, a page, a few pages. But basically, different types of reports can be shorter like that. And they give you some different examples through this particular chapter. And I wanted to make you aware of that. But they also give some examples at the end on page 240. And just the last point that I wanted to mention to you here in chapter 9 is formal reports. Typically, if you write a formal report, you're going to be doing it with a group of people rather than individually. So if you look at the example on page 278, there is a cover page, there is a letter of transmittal or a memo of transmittal. Either one will suffice. It depends as far as what you're sending. And then there's on 281 a much more descriptive table of contents, and then they break that down. And notice how on 283 they also have tables and figures. If in a report, if you're including some appendices or addendums or anything like that, you can include that at the end. And notice, I mean, in that at the end of the table of contents. And then notice also too, on page 284, there's an executive summary. An executive summary is for a longer report. An abstract or like that, or an introductory section or an introductory overview is more for shorter reports, but an executive summary is for that. Then they have the introduction, and then they go on through. They have a couple of different examples there. So I like to make you familiar with the nuances of this book. We are going to do an open book test this semester. It's not hard, and you are going to use your book, but I just like to refer you to it and make you aware of what's in it. And I really have liked this book. I've used it for several editions, and I think it's effective. So those are the key points that I wanted to get into today, and thank you very much.